Conflict in the classroom can take various forms. It may show up as a student challenging your authority as a teacher, as a remark that offends, as a discussion that grows heated when students express clashing perspectives. During such conflict moments, how do you feel? If conflict makes you feel anxious, fearful, unsure how to respond, you're not alone. For many of us, conflict feels like a problem, a signal that something has gone uncomfortably wrong. When conflict erupts in classes we're teaching, we may try to fix the conflict as hastily as possible, or even ignore it altogether, because we don't want tensions and heated emotions to disrupt student learning. But what if the conflict itself represents a potential learning opportunity? This is the perspective offered by conflict transformation, an approach that reframes conflict in two ways. First, that conflict is normal, a natural part of the everyday ebb and flow of human relationships and interactions. And second, that conflict is a potential catalyst for growth and positive change, if we can engage the conflict constructively. Admittedly, that's a large if. It's certainly possible, and all too common, for conflict to be engaged destructively and cause harm. So we need strategies that help us address conflict more thoughtfully and confidently. After all, if conflict is a normal part of everyday life, we can expect it to sometimes show up in the classroom or elsewhere on campus. And if, as teachers, we're prepared to face these conflict moments well, then we'll be better able to minimize potential disruptions to learning and maximize the learning opportunities conflict may offer. To help with that, this presentation outlines 4 key steps to productively handling conflict moments in the classroom. Step 1, acknowledge. In a moment when conflict is felt in the classroom, it is so important that the instructor say or do something to acknowledge the conflict. What's most important here is that we strive to be authentically present, not perfect. I stress this because too often the fear of saying the wrong thing stops us from saying anything at all. But simply ignoring the conflict will not make it disappear. Instead, it's likely to fester and reappear later in more damaging ways. So how might you acknowledge a conflict in the moment? One way to do this is to pause and name the tension you yourself are feeling. To say something like, I can tell there are strong emotions in the room right now, and I'm feeling a lot too. Let's take a beat and think about where these emotions are coming from. If the topic that has come up is a controversial or sensitive one, it can help to name that out loud, to acknowledge that this may be hard to talk about, especially if students are personally affected by the issue. Or if you're unsure how to respond yet and need a moment to gather your thoughts, it's also okay to say that. What matters here is not being eloquent or polished, but rather acknowledging the tension and creating enough of a pause that you and your students can be mindful in how you respond. Step 2, discern. The second key step is to discern whether or not this is the right time and place for a fuller discussion of the conflict that has just emerged. A few considerations can help in this discernment. First, how relevant is the conflict issue to the course content and learning outcomes? And relatedly, how much time do you have to give to this issue, whether in this current class session or in the course overall? Another consideration is, what emotional space are your students in? And what do they most need right now in order to fruitfully learn? Finally, how are you as the instructor feeling? Do you feel grounded enough and sufficiently knowledgeable that you're ready to facilitate a fuller discussion right now? When all the conditions are right for fruitful dialogue, learning can be transformative. But other times, it's better to acknowledge why now isn't the right time and place for further discussion. Try to do this in a way that doesn't dismiss the significance of the conflict issue or emotions, yet stays focused on the learning outcomes and purpose of class. Be clear with students that your priority as an instructor is to support them in learning what the course is intended to teach. Step 3, de-escalate. When conflict erupts in the classroom, it's normal for tensions and emotions to be running high. If we permit our emotions to drive the conversation in a reactive or defensive way, it's much harder to engage in the careful listening and critical thinking needed for transformative learning. So it's important to de-escalate the emotional temperature of the classroom. And this is true whether you and your students are about to enter a fuller discussion of the conflict itself or are about to turn back to a different topic or activity. Let me be clear, de-escalating does not mean invalidating strongly felt emotions. Rather, it's about slowing down the pace of the conversation, giving ourselves more space to feel and reflect, to listen and respond to each other with thoughtfulness and care. What are some de-escalation techniques? One is to take a short break from the discussion. This may be a literal break in the class period, or it may be a shift in activity. If you and your students need to reground yourselves, a brief mindfulness exercise or a few minutes of reflective writing might help. Also, note that more highly structured facilitation often has a de-escalating effect. For example, you might use a talking piece or a circle process to guide participants in taking turns to speak. Another de-escalation technique is to make process observations. That is, to pause and name what you're noticing about the group dynamics or behaviors. To engage in fruitful dialogue requires awareness of how we're talking with each other, as well as what we're talking about. And process observations can heighten that awareness. Step 4, follow up. The fourth key step to engage conflict well is to follow up as needed. If you do facilitate a fuller discussion about the conflict, either right away or in a later class period, then that discussion itself may constitute the follow-up. Often, it's also helpful to close that discussion by asking students to reflect on their learning and lingering questions. Or, if you've discerned it's best not to use class time to further discuss the conflict, it's still wise to check in with students afterwards about how they're feeling, and especially to reach out directly to any students who were particularly impacted. Finally, remember you're not alone in supporting your students' well-being. Remind students of the on-campus resources and safe spaces available to them if they need further processing or support. Resources such as student affinity centers, the Dean of Students office, or counseling available through the Student Health and Wellness Center. All four of these steps, acknowledge, discern, de-escalate, and follow up, are important pieces to engaging conflict constructively in and beyond the classroom. But what these steps look like in action will vary considerably from one situation to another. Further, they may not happen exactly in the linear order in which I've just presented them. When a conflict unexpectedly erupts in your classroom, you may jump immediately into discernment. And then, what you discern is needed will likely shape how you acknowledge what is happening. And your acknowledgement may start to de-escalate the tension. What I've offered here is really a conflict transformation mindset and portfolio of strategies. The more we as teachers can adopt this mindset and practice these strategies, the better able we'll be to constructively engage conflict for the sake of learning and growth.